Well, good afternoon, and thank you for coming. We got a rowdy crowd tonight. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this year's Jerome Hall Lecture at the Law School. Jerome Hall was a beloved faculty member of our school from 1939 until 1970. He was a pioneer in interdisciplinary analysis of legal problems, and his scholarship on criminal law and jurisprudence was internationally recognized. Though he died in 1992, his work is still regularly cited today. Professor Hall's focus and approach has a deep place in our institution's history, and the law school is named in his honor. You know you've reached something when you get a bronze bust as well as a photo as a faculty member. That really means you've taken it to the next level. Our faculty continue to embrace Hall's work in their research and writing. The Hall Lecture Series brings influential and remarkable scholars to the school each year. Recent lecturers have included Malcolm Feely from UC Berkeley School of Law, Rachel Moran from UCLA, Thomas Green from the University of Michigan, Sanford Levison of the University of Texas. Today, it's the law school's honor to introduce Professor June Carbone, the Rabina Chair in Law, Science, and Technology at the University of Minnesota Law School, and the school's Associate Dean for Research. Professor Carbone has had an impressive career and is one of the nation's foremost experts in family law, assisted reproduction, law, medicine, and bioethics. In addition to being at the faculty of Minnesota, she has served on faculty in the University of Missouri, the University of Santa Clara School of Law, George Mason University School of Law, as a visiting scholar at Stanford University's Institute for Research on Women and Gender. She's a prolific scholar, and her most recent book on marriage and how inequality is remaking the American family was published by Oxford University Press. Both Newsweek and The Economist listed as the top 20 book for the year of 2014. Professor Carbone has received a wide range of awards for her scholarship. She received her JD from Yale Law School, her bachelor's from the Woodrow Wilson School for Public and International Affairs at Princeton, and she served in the Department of Justice before entering academia. Please join me in warmly welcoming this year's Hall Lecture.
So, well, thank you very much for having me. And I'd like to thank Jody Madera and the Dean and the Law School and the University of Indiana, and to tell you why I'm especially happy to be here. You may look outside and see a bleak gray day. I look outside and think, no snow. Having just gotten here from several inches in Minneapolis, I'm delighted to be here. The other thing I think I might comment on is, why does your family law professor talk about corporate law? I will tell you, everything is about family law. But this project began with the end of our last book, which is called Marriage Markets: How Inequality is Remaking the American Family. What we were struck by in that book is that when we looked at marriage and the family, we found the only group in American society for whom marriage rates have increased are the top 10% of women by income. And when we started looking at what is happening to the top 10% of women by income, the answer is that the gendered wage gap has increased dramatically post-1990. And we started looking at that and saying, what's going on? And so as we have dug deeper, we have come to do a series of pieces. The first one is called Death of the Firm. It was about Hobby Lobby, but it asks the question how the changing shape of employment and the understanding of what the firm, quote unquote, is about, changes the underlying social contract. This piece built on some of those insights to talk about the idea of equality and of anti-discrimination law in an era of growing inequality. And to do that, we wanted to get into and to dig deep into the question, what is increasing gender inequality at the top of the economy? And what are the broader implications, not just for women, but for the very idea of employment, for advancement, and for equality in broader terms. So with that introduction, I'm going to start with the question of the idea of equality. And so when we were looking at recent discussions, we were very struck that whether you're talking about the right, which believes in formal equality or equal treatment, or the left, which tends to look at equal outcomes and to often view equal results as an end in itself, that both are committed to an idea of equality as though it is separate from the idea of the economic organization of society. And we wanted to go back and argue that has not been historically true. So if you look at more conservative views of equal treatment, Justice Scalia, who always stands out as distinctive on everything, very strikingly embraced Brown versus Board of Education, the idea that de jure segregation ought to violate the 14th Amendment as right as a matter of originalism. He also wrote the majority opinion for the Supreme Court in a case called On Call, which is about a man on an oil rig who's claiming he is being harassed by other men. And Scalia said, yes, if the man on the oil rig is treated differently from a woman on an oil rig, that too can be discrimination. Again, in the form of equal treatment. Justice Thomas has taken the same approach with respect to gerrymandering on the basis of race. He's against it on the basis of race. Doesn't matter who it helps, who it hurts. It's formal consideration of race, and he's opposed. On the left, what you often see is the use of equality as a substitute for other substantive values. What do I mean by that? I mean that it becomes an end in itself. And so you have a series of cases, and in the paper underlying this, we went through some of the history of Title VII interpretation that finds that requiring exams as a condition for employment where it has a disparate impact on the basis of race violates Title VII. But pregnancy accommodations that are granted, the failure to grant temporary pregnancy accommodations does not, unless, as a matter of equal treatment, men who have temporary disabilities are getting better treatment. And so we thought the view of the left, which views all of this as disparate impact, all of it ought to be illegal under Title VII, does not explain the outcome of the cases. And we struggled with the question, what then is the underlying conception that explains why written examinations in fact violate Title VII where they have a disparate racial impact, but the failure to provide pregnancy accommodations does not, where they also have a disparate impact on the basis of gender? And to answer that question, we went back to the origins of Title VII, and we argued that Title VII is rooted not just in a commitment to equality, although it is. I mean, it makes a moral commitment that discrimination is wrong, but it also gives it substance by rooting it in an economic conception of equality. And our argument in the paper is to recover the promise of Title VII requires rethinking in fundamental ways what economic equality is about. So, history of Title VII. What happens, and I'll get to the slide in a moment, what happens? 1961, John F. Kennedy becomes president, middle of a recession. If you, and you don't recall, I'm looking out in the audience, I recall, I was 7. The spirit of the Kennedy administration was in part can do, but technocratic, smart, tough, best experts of the time assembled to think through the problem. And the answer was Keynesianism. No real alternative to Keynesianism as to how to stimulate the economy. Rather, the debate in the Kennedy administration was tax cuts versus increased spending. And the Kennedy administration embraced tax cuts. There were 82% marginal tax rates on individual income in the Eisenhower years, and the Kennedy administration thought, we can make Keynesianism more palatable by linking it to tax cuts. And the tax cuts worked brilliantly. Stock market soared, corporate profits were up, but unemployment stayed high. And the Kennedy administration in that era thought of expansion of the labor market as a matter of national interest, that full employment was national policy. And by the way, then as now, the effect of tax cuts was just about exactly the same and did not work. So the commitment to civil rights in that era was structured in the context of this effort to promote economic expansion. And the analysis was that the obstacle to full employment was the segmented nature of the labor market. And by that I mean both that the labor market is segmented and that it is segmented by race. So the good jobs in the era were jobs that were permanent. They offered a career ladder. They offered regular raises and promotions. They involved employers who invested in employees. But getting the jobs was hard. Keeping them was not. Getting the jobs was hard. And what you had is not just that there were good jobs, union jobs, for example, that offered the benefits, but also that there thrived, particularly in the South, a set of low-wage industries that depended on cheap labor and that hired overwhelmingly African Americans. And so this commitment to Title VII and the anti-discrimination principle in employment was coupled with this idea that the problem was market segmentation by race. And I would note, when you look at studies of Title VII and what impact it had, in the 10 years from 65 to 75, had almost no impact on women, but it had a substantial impact in reducing racial disparities, particularly in the South, and particularly for African American men. And what was taking place in that time period is the South was booming. It was becoming, air conditioning is the key, but it was becoming part of the national economy. And so what you had through a period of economic expansion was eliminating these low-wage employers that depended on racial segregation to have a workforce. So when Kennedy promotes this in 63, he sees it as a three-legged stool. He gives a national address on it, and he talks about it in terms of we need more economic stimulus. So we're not simply replacing one set of workers with another set of workers. We need training and education, and we need anti-discrimination law, and they need to operate in tandem. And the goal is economic expansion. And so we argue that when you go back to the history of Title VII, you have to see the anti-discrimination principle as interpreted in tandem with a commitment to economic equality. And so therefore the key becomes, as I've said, is the entry into good jobs with career ladders. Now, what about women? So there's a whole long history of the question, how did women get into Title VII? Gender was not in the bill originally. It gets added on the floor of Congress. There is some suggestion it was to make it a joke, to defeat the bill. But in fact, when you go back and look, you see that there were two really important groups that advocated for the inclusion of gender. One is African American women. And African American women had the worst jobs in the economy at the time. And they were concerned that if gender was not included, they would continue to have the worst jobs, with discrimination on the basis of gender rather than race. And Howard Smith, who was the senator from Virginia, he put in the provision and he said he wanted to make sure his women weren't discriminated against, i.e., if you outlaw discrimination on the basis of race, but not gender, his concern was that white women would be at a disadvantage. So both African American women concerned about discrimination and the champions of white women in the Senate embrace the idea that gender ought to be included. But the point we noted in tracing through the history of the subsequent cases is while gender was added, and while the cases clearly come out that if there is formal discrimination on the basis of gender, it violates Title VII, there was nothing addressing the critical things that tend to disadvantage women in the workforce: pregnancy, family responsibilities. And indeed, if you go back to the 60s, there wasn't much notion that that was a problem. That is, women should be home taking care of children. The idea that that might be part of something that limits opportunities for economic equality wasn't part of the debate. So our argument is that when you look and you trace the history of the cases that come afterwards, and particularly the issue of pregnancy disability or accommodation of pregnancy, much less childcare, what you see is that you really get movement only after 2007, when Congress includes in the disability discrimination provisions a requirement that employers offer temporary accommodation for employees with disability as a general matter. And we argue that one of the issues underlying this is that principle, should employers have to provide for employees with temporary disability, shouldn't be shoehorned into an issue of sex discrimination. It's part of a more general issue: what are employer responsibilities? And if you're not engaging that debate, you can't really deal with pregnancy, except as a matter of either special pleading, women need to be protected, or you're going to lose. And one of my co-authors edited out of the article, to my frustration, Judge Posner saying in the 80s, in spite of what feminists think, Title VII does not extend to pregnancy discrimination. And I think what he is saying is what I am saying up here, namely that you need a substantive idea of equality to reach these issues. So where are we today? I'm going to now switch gears, and with that introduction say, to understand gender inequality in the workforce requires looking at inequality more generally. And when you do, one of our dilemmas in writing the article is that a lot of what I'm going to say also applies to race, but you'll see when I get to the end and pull the rabbit out of the hat, that's a different argument. And so I'm going to focus here on gender. Start with this. Now, my co-authors don't like my showing you this chart. Why? Because I produced it. And I'm very proud of it. Now, when we first started noticing the data, I thought, well, let's take a look at the gendered wage gap by education. And when I did that, there weren't any nice little slides on the web, so I created one with my little calculator. I did it myself. I presented it in a symposium piece. It was published in a law review, and the students double-checked my math. I have confidence in the students. But what this showed, and we were really the first to produce a graph that looks like this, is that if you go back to 1990 and you calculate the gendered wage gap the way the gendered wage gap is calculated more generally. So this doesn't control for things like what job you have. It just says, in general, what percentage of the male wage are women earning? And what you find in 1990 is education doesn't make much difference. To the extent it does, college graduates earn a little bit more of the male wage than women with less education. But the differences are really small. Now you go to 2007, and what you find is that education matters dramatically. So for high school dropouts, we're almost at 80%. This is, you might say, a huge improvement, but what's really going on is less educated men earn dramatically less than they used to. So the gendered wage gap has decreased. But if you look at college graduate women in 2007 earn a smaller percentage of the, quote, male wage than they did in 1990. And this is the issue we sought to explain. I also am going to show you this slide, which I actually don't like as much, but it's a professional one. So you can see that I must be onto something, even if I got the math wrong. And what you see is, again, because this is 1980 rather than 1990, it doesn't show a decline for college graduate women, that's this number, but it does show that it's dramatically less of an increase. And I will tell you that the big increase in women's income vis-a-vis men occurs in the 80s, and it occurs as a result of higher educational achievement by women. So some validation. When you start looking, though, at what's going on in the economy, these are the big stories. The first part is this is the ratio of CEO to average worker pay. So the big thing that is happening is there are some parts of the economy with dramatic increases in income at a time when most of the rest of the economy has very little increases in income. And what I'm going to show is how all of the areas with really dramatic increases in income are predominantly male, and women either lose ground or don't make any advances. So we start with CEOs, and we find, 1965 average ratio, 20 to 1. By 2016, it's 346 to 1. But women are only 4% of Fortune 500 CEOs. And while there are any number of women CEOs, women in general who are CEOs earn 46% less than male CEOs, adjusting for age and education. Now, the single biggest reason is women tend to be CEOs of things like nonprofits rather than, say, General Electric. But even so, the differences are dramatic. On a more prosaic basis, let's take finance, and let's take all of finance. Pay in finance as a whole doubled between 1982 and 2007 in comparison with the rest of the economy where the increases are small. But the number of women on Wall Street drops after 2000. So during that boom, the number of women dropped. Venture capital firms, women were at something like 10% in 1999, 6% in 2015. And if you do a measure of where are the biggest gender differences in the economy, the top 6 categories are all in finance. So you ask, where are gendered differences greatest by looking at various categories? The top 6 are all in finance, and they're not just in the top ranks. They are personal financial advisors, financial analysts, financial clerks, and this chart adds in things like farmers, ranchers, and morticians. Why? Only so that all the top categories aren't finance. There are smaller differences for morticians and ranchers than there are for personal financial advisors. When you look at professionals, gender gap among lawyers is not that bad overall, 22%, but for large firm equity partners, 44%. Gender gap for doctors, it's greatest in the cities with the highest overall medical pay. Charlotte, North Carolina is one. But the startling thing is the entry-level gap for doctors increased from the 90s into the mid-2000s, even controlling for specialty education and hours worked. So you're seeing an increase, and it tends to be concentrated wherever pay is increasing most. Here's women in tech, and this I find this chart startling. So these are STEM occupations. This is computer and mathematical occupations. You can see a decline from 1990, with a little bit of an uptick in 2013. A couple of notes. Women in computer sciences fell from a high in the 80s back down now to about what the percentages were at the time of the movie Hidden Figures, about the African-American women at NASA. And if you say, what are the occupations that pay the most at college graduation, it is computer-related occupations with a substantial increase. Math, women also are highly represented in math, but the decline is not as great as it is in computer sciences. And fun fact, some studies show if you take down the Star Trek posters in computer labs and put up pictures of nature scenes, women feel more at home. But let's go to the explanations. So the conventional explanation, ask any economist, is long hours. And in fact, long hours does have a lot to do with this. Women with children are more likely to drop out of jobs that require 60 hours a week. But we think there's an argument as well that when you look at long hours, that long hours are both a cause of greater gender disparities and a product of greater competition. So if you go back to 1960 and you look at the difference between white collar men and blue collar men, they work about the same number of hours. That is, and they have about the same amount of leisure time, although white collar men help out around the home a little bit more than blue collar men. Today, the U.S. women at the top of the economy work longer hours than women anywhere else in the world. And the top men are on a par with Asian men in terms of top hours at the top of the economic ladder. What you also find, let me stick with this a moment too. What you also find is that if you control for hours, you still have a large part of the wage gap that remains unexplained. And you find something else. You find that if you do studies, men are a lot more likely to cheat about how many hours they work and get away with it, which is going to be a consistent refrain in our talk. Women are assumed to work less, even if they don't, when you see management studies. The other explanation, and this one is particularly popular now, so the psych folks who have to have new things to work on used to say women are just risk averse. And there's a whole literature about women and risk. And you find out that if you do studies and you look at entrepreneurs, financial managers, people who select into high-risk occupations, risk managers, there are very few, if any, gender differences. And while there are gender differences in the lab about risk, they somehow don't apply to Chinese women. So if you take a look, I love this slide, bubble parody. We have researchers who decided to test women in risk. And what they do is they create these experimental economies in the lab, get a bunch of students together and give them scenarios and have them trade and see what happens. So in the lab, the researchers create a boom followed by a bust, and they want to see what students in the lab will do in terms of investments. And the trading by men, if we take American men, and we look, these are the women. You create a bubble. The women become appropriately more cautious. The men say, hey, we can cash in. Let's do it. Now, again, this is in the lab. These are students. But what happens when the students are Chinese? With a study done in China, not in the United States. The answer, very little gender difference. So even in orientation toward risk, you tend to see that the differences are contextual and they've been debunked. So the news story, psychologists need a news story. The news story is competition as opposed to risk. And they find, and some of these studies are really quite fascinating. They find, for example, in the lab, undergraduates, if you give a choice of piecework versus competitive pay, 73% of the men, but only 35% of the women select the contest. The women much prefer plain old piecework rather than competitive pay. And that's true even if you control for things like whether or not women feel they're good at the task. There's a natural experiment. Researchers studied want-ads. And what they found is that if the want-ads emphasized relative performance measures, competitive environment, opportunity to, if you're that good, to earn top dollars, the number of men over women application doubles. And mostly the women choose not to apply. The difference among the men is smaller. And then there are the studies of nursing that have been on the front page of the New York Times, things like if you advertise cooperative environment, work in a team, get to help people, feel good about yourself, number of women who apply increases compared to men. So there is a gendered effect tied to competition. But those studies are now being debunked as well in a variety of ways, and we have a different version of this story. Our version goes like this. There has been in the time period, post-1990, a wholesale change in management culture, a shift to an emphasis on shareholder value, quarterly capitalism. Ask your corporate law professors about this. But what it means is a focus on short-term fluctuation in share price. As part of that, executive compensation has been tied much more heavily to bonuses. And indeed, if you ask the question, what's the difference between finance and everybody else? The extent to which compensation is tied to bonuses on Wall Street, it's often 3/4 of overall salary is the annual bonus rather than base pay. You see that these bonuses are steeply banked. What the CEO gets compared to the number 2 person is substantial. Go down and look at number 5 versus number 6, and there may be substantial differences in a company. What you also find is there's a whole discussion now of how hyper-competition replaces meritocracies. That language I'm taking from Eli Wald in an article about law firms. And he is talking about when you look at the modern culture of the big law firm, the emphasis on profit for partner, on being available 24/7 for customer service tied to the ability to increase billable hours, but less emphasis on professional judgment or cultivation of professional culture. When you look at the literature on rankings, so corporate America is switched to performance pay, annual rankings, big bonuses. The most extreme of these systems is called rank and yank, and I'm going to talk about it in a minute. Jack Welch developed it at GE. What you do is you rate everybody every year. The bottom 10% are basically told you're slated to be voted off the island. The top 20% or so are being groomed for promotions, and you re-rate everybody every year. So if you want to shake up a big bureaucratic company like GE in the 80s, Welch came in and effectively got rid of 20% or 20 to 25% of his employees in the first 5 years he was there. And he used this system to shake things up, and it succeeded. But there's now a variety of subsequent studies. The management literature, by the way, if you want progressivism in corporate culture, read management psych literature. And what the management psych literature, and it really started taking hold after Enron. So Jack Welch's number 1 disciple was Jeff Skilling at Enron. And Jeff Skilling came in, and the best way, and Jack Welch says this, by the way, you want to turn a company around, you want them to buy into your new ethos, implement this evaluation system. What happens? All of a sudden, the people who are saying, we don't do things that way, this is unethical, this will blow up the firm. You give them a low evaluation, sour grapes, nobody takes them seriously. In the meantime, all you have to do is hint, gee, we really need to improve the bottom line in this area. Well, the most recent, not the most recent, but a recent insider trading case that ultimately ended without a conviction. What the CEO is doing is saying, here are the metrics, and this is the basis for evaluation. And then his minions fall in line, lots of insider trading, but he doesn't even have to know about it because he incentivizes that kind of behavior and it creates deniability. So what these systems do is they pit employees against each other, and they're easy to orient for whatever top management wants. But top management is also tied to an incentive system linked to annual bonuses that correspond to earnings and shareholder value. Post Enron, there had been in fact, for the last 20 years, there had been a whole series of management evaluations, and they find such systems produce higher levels of distrust that undermine teamwork, greater homogeneity in corporate management, meaning people who think alike. Not necessarily discrimination on the basis of race and gender, but that too. Less managerial accountability, more politicized decision-making, basically Game of Thrones type atmosphere in which small groups identify with each other to undermine the competition, their fellow employees. And even Michael Jensen, the Harvard Business School prof who was the guru of compensation based on performance, he recanted in 2001 saying it's a bad idea. He now gets paid a whole lot of money by corporate boards for explaining how ethics is important in corporate leadership. But the best summary is Larry Ripstein. Those of you who don't know, Larry Ripstein was a professor at the University of Illinois. He's a libertarian, very rooted in the law and economics movement. This is his summary. These executives are the hyper-motivated survivors of a highly competitive tournament who have proven their ability to make money while putting on a veneer of loyalty to the firm. At least some of the new breed appeared to be Machiavellian, narcissistic, prevaricating, pathologically optimistic, free from self-doubt and moral distraction, and willing to take great risks as the company moves up and to lie when things turn bad. Now, this is coming from a conservative who wrote this article to oppose Sarbanes-Oxley reforms. So where we're now going with this is, what does this atmosphere do? And I'm quoting management literature. This is not your progressive family law or progressive corporate law reformers. This is the management literature about how to run a company. And they say when you move in this direction, highly competitive, and again, internal competitions, bonus-based pay, reductionist measures of performance, you also see the people who are selected in this environment are the narcissists. Narcissism rules in corporate America. There are books about the charismatic CEO and the selection for the qualities associated with narcissism. The title of the slide is from the Harvard Business Review. It is a defense of the narcissistic leader. And you should think, you want to know who we're talking about here. Think Steve Jobs. Think Mark Zuckerberg. The ability to push through massive transformation, confidence in their vision for a company, ability to inspire and charm others, the determination to implement whatever obstacles get in the way. Those are the upsides. And the downsides: hubris, lack of empathy, no attention to ethics. So we now argue, if you see this picture of corporate America that is now selecting for the charismatic CEO who can walk into a boardroom, immediately impress, and promise to take you to the next level tomorrow, save the company about to fail, or in the middle of a boom, outperform all the other people who are booming. What you see is that this is now systematic selection for charismatic leaders over technocratic managers. You become more likely to select from without. The tenure of upper management has shrunk. And I will say, when we look at the stories of, we're compiling a series of stories of women who file sex discrimination suits. What's striking is it's musical chairs. The women move every couple of years to a new job within the same company. If you're in finance, they move to a different company, but that's partly because companies fail and are acquired by others and are now part of too big to fail banks. And even if you stayed in the same job for 20 years, you would have maybe 4 different employers in that period. So there's enormous movement. It now emphasizes, and when you then look at who thrives in that kind of environment where everybody's looking around their shoulder at everyone else, narcissists tend to differ from other people based on they're drawn to power and control. They are more likely to use competitive evaluation systems. This all comes from the management literature. And that companies select for those who can inspire, and it produces an emphasis on short-term results. This recreates a lot of the element, not really of an old boys club, but a young boys club. This is a young boys game. It is male, but it tends to also favor the young folks who come in, will work long hours, and are focused on how can I get ahead, and I don't care what happens 5 years from now. And now when you look at the gender effects, first, men in general are more likely to be narcissists, but there's some evidence that the gender gap in narcissism on college campuses is closing. And in any event, there are lots of female narcissists. When you look at the question, what's the difference between male and female narcissists? Just taking narcissists. First, like to be the center of attention, no gender gap. Male narcissists are more likely than females to be drawn to power and positions that promise money, status, and authority. And narcissists in general, but male narcissists in particular, tend to view money, status, and authority as validations of self-worth. So they tend to be drawn to such positions, but also to view such measures as important. If you don't get them, it means the people around you aren't treating you as good as you think you are, and that's a bad thing. But the largest gender differences among narcissists tend to be the greater willingness, okay, I don't know what happened, the greater willingness to demand rewards for themselves and to use greater status to exploit others. So the gender gaps tend to be greatest among people who count as narcissists in the downsides of narcissism. Now, I don't know what this is. You have logged in? I'm probably supposed to hit something that I don't know what to do. So if anybody does. Okay. Great. Thank you. Well done. Well done. So when you then look at what happens in a system that selects both for the upside and the downside of narcissists, it actually looks a lot like the gender literature. So you find when you look at a study of tech firms, that is not about gender, by the way, and you rate, the employees are asked to rate the CEO's personality traits. Those who rate highest in narcissism tend to receive more total direct compensation in terms of salary, bonus, and stock options, have more money in their total shareholdings, and you see larger discrepancies between their own compensation and other members of their team. Now, this tends to be the classic women don't ask for raises literature. In fact, there's good evidence women do, they just don't get them. But when you don't look at gender at all, and you just look at selection for narcissism, you tend to find it increases the gap between the top person and the people who are lower down on the totem pole. Now apply this to women. The classic double bind is that, let me start with what the classic double bind is and then apply this. So the classic double bind is that women lose if they don't compete on the same terms as men. But if they do compete on the same terms as men, the men don't like it. And that, so double bind, lose-lose, either way. We argue that when you look at the kind of culture created by internal competitions, highly banked bonuses, and that pick for narcissistic qualities, that what you do is you create a world where there is a high reward for those who can break the rules and get away with it. We argue actually when Donald Trump said, you know, I could stand on Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and my supporters would still be with me. What he's really saying is, I'm a really good businessman. That what you have is a system now, especially in finance, but in a number of other top arenas, that reward the people who can break the rules and get away with it. So here is a study of finance, and this to me could be the coda for the entire talk. When you look at financial advisors, who are the group with the highest gender gaps in compensation in the entire economy, you find 1 of 13 financial advisors have a record of misconduct. And we met with somebody, a Hill staffer, who's doing a study suggesting these numbers are increasing. Men in the study are more likely, and 1 in 13 is a really high number, to have been found guilty of misconduct. Men are 3 times more likely to engage in the misconduct, according to the study, twice as likely to be repeat offenders. They commit offenses 20% more costly to their employers. But women are 20% more likely to lose their jobs and 30% less likely to find new ones compared to the men. Classic double bind. When you ask the question why, you find the disparities are less in female-controlled firms, but female-controlled financial firms are rare. You also find that the big difference is that with men, customers initiate 55% of the complaints compared to 28% from their employers. With women, Customers initiate 44%, employers 41%. The employers are doing in the female employees engaged in misconduct. That's much less true for the men, even though they're committing more egregious, at least in terms of dollar losses, misconduct. So our conclusion, and we have a number of other bits of evidence on this, but in finance, the evidence is dramatic. We argue what's really going on is that greater emphasis on internal competition, not competition between firms, but competition within firms, creates greater selection for the traits associated with narcissism and a greater willingness to forgive the downside of those traits. This reinforces gender stereotypes because of the overlap between the upside of narcissism and male qualities, and then the forgiving of the downside of the male negative aspects of narcissism in a way that reinforces gender stereotypes. This in turn reinforces the double bind, especially as you move toward less regulated environments where the ability to break the rules and get away with it is important to advancement. Women see this and don't apply, which in turn reinforces the entire cycle. I'm going to end there. In the paper, I have discussed some things that apply to Title VII. We have a discussion of Ellen Pao and why she loses. In Silicon Valley, a discussion of the class action against Microsoft that is proceeding, challenging the competitive evaluation practices as sex discrimination. But this is the point on which I want to end. If you look at the idea of equality in an era of much greater equality, we do not have a substantive conception of what economic equality is going to be about going forward. And unless you look at the top and the restraint of the practices at the top, I think you cannot successfully address sex discrimination in particular, but inequality more generally in American society. Thank you.
Now, if the people has like any question, Ken and we can reach you out with the microphones. Okay. Just raise your hand, please.
So I gather people will line up at the microphones if you want to ask questions. No one has any questions.
First, thank you for coming down to balmy Southern Indiana.
It is balmy.
I lived in Minnesota, I understand. I'm wondering if you see, whether you looked at this or not, but it seems sort of like a bit of a Gordian Knot kind of dynamic at play in the work environment. You know, the cycles seem to sort of indicate that there's no beginning or end to it. I'm wondering if you saw in in sort of business schools or in undergrad, if you're seeing the same kinds of dynamics playing out, and if there's anything that can maybe short circuit this cycle before you get there in the business school environment or in the undergrad environment.
Yeah, you certainly, by the way, you see a lot of self-selection in terms of B school majors. So those attracted to business school and economics tend to be more interested in making money. Some would argue less interested in ethics, and that these tendencies increase over the amount of time they're in school. But I'm actually very skeptical. I mean, I think selection effects are real, but there are women in these environments who have all the same traits. I think what takes place in the workplace is an effect, it reflects these reinforcing qualities in a way where it is not a matter simply of preaching more ethics. And the kind of thing that when we've looked at this, you know, what would make a difference in this? I'll tell you, 90% marginal tax rates. Now, I am not in favor of 90% marginal tax rates. But in the other piece we did called The Death of the Firm, which is not about gender so much, we went back and looked. What was the difference between the post-war era with very high marginal tax rates and the current era? And to answer that, I like to give the example of compare George Romney, the dad, who was a businessman, governor of Michigan, ran for president, with Mitt Romney, the son, businessman, governor of Massachusetts, ran for president. George Romney thought the measure of his success as a businessman was the health of American motors. Mitt Romney viewed the measure of his success as a businessman as how much money he had in the Cayman Islands. And there were pieces in the Wall Street Journal saying if Mitt Romney were really a good businessman, he would have $1 billion and not be paying taxes on it instead of $200 million. But nobody talks about the health of bank capital as the measure of business success. And I argue that that mindset, that when you look at what would change this picture, a mindset where the institution is more important than the individual and competition is channeled in favor of collective ends rather than individual ends, changes this. When you look at women in competition and you make it team-based, women are just as competitive as men and willing to stab others in the back, by the way.
June, this was a terrific. It was such a great use of my time to be here. Really enjoyed it. I mean, I think that you started off with a kind of a judicial analysis, or kind of looking through the Title VII and equal protection stuff, and then we went pretty far afield and past the statutes into kind of I think a really great analysis of what I'll call late stage kind of capitalism, because I don't know what comes next, and I'm curious because the solutions that you're talking about, I mean, you proffered one about maybe progressive tax rates could remedy this, but you're really talking about a mindset or a culture shift, and so yes. You brought this analysis, which is new and fresh in my mind here. I'm just wondering if you could think about any realistic, any prescriptive advice, even if it's your first pass at it. I'd love to hear some prescriptive advice.
Okay, so
is this a very original analysis? I think you really connected a lot of dots for me.
Thank you. Yeah, we have, so the technical part, we do at the end of the paper. I always skip this part because it's boring unless you're really into Title VII law. But we do have some analysis of the difference between individual cases versus disparate impact cases and where disparate impact can be successful. But the key to disparate impact cases tied to competitive evaluation systems. For anybody who remembers EEOC versus Sears, which tried this in the 80s and lost, is that you need both a demonstration of the disparities. So in the Microsoft litigation, challenging the Microsoft use of rank and yank, this is a 2013 case, you had 80% of the evaluators were men, and that was enough to trigger disparate impact. But the key is that once you trigger that, is this a legitimate business practice? Well, the lawsuit generated publicity in Vanity Fair talking about, I think Vanity Fair was Microsoft's lost decade, and Forbes was the evaluation system designed to ruin your best people. And arguing that the evaluation system and the emphasis on Game of Thrones at Microsoft was responsible for Microsoft's lack of competitiveness with Apple. And we do argue in a technical way that you need both. You need the disparities and you need it being linked to a discrediting of the business practices. But in terms of the economy more generally, to win on Title VII, but in terms of a more general approach, you need to discredit the idea that it's $200 million in which you don't pay taxes. Off stored away in the Cayman Islands that makes you qualified to run for president. I think you do have to disqualify that. And if you did, you would see a whole series of measures. I mean, I think, shifting away from shareholder value to something that looked at how do you encourage longer term decisions and corporate decision making. But our other article on Death of the Firm argued at the end that if you understand this mindset where companies simply become pieces on a chessboard that are designed to enrich their owners, but have no larger set of social purposes, then they are inappropriate partners for things like healthcare. And you ought to be rethinking government so that individuals are as fluid, flexible, network-based as companies, and the ability to retool in the face of economic change. And that means a direct relationship between government and empowering individuals, as opposed to using institutions like corporations as the middleman for those policies. My favorite, go back to school, free card, you get laid off, a plant closes, go back to school free, as a way of increasing human capital. But that's really a much more general and ambitious kind of thing. Final point, we talk a lot, we're writing a book on the gender part, and we talk about, does add women and stir work? If you simply increase the percentage of women, do you see a change? Well, Francis Fukuyama, when he wrote The End of History and the Last Man, forget the end of history part, focus on the last man. The last man is the Nietzschean last man. And he's essentially describing how the will to power tends to disrupt institutions. What almost no one knows is he had a companion piece in Foreign Affairs at the same time, talking about the inclusion in women in foreign policy decision-making and how it tends to even out foreign policy decision-making, restraining the cowboys. I think something like that is going on here, that women are the canary in the mine for a system that corporate leaders like Warren Buffett and the head of BlackRock are saying is in trouble. And that people like Larry Summers describe the loss of productivity on a global basis. I think the system has something to do with that. And to get real reform, you have to see this as a threat to global peace, a threat to prosperity, a threat to economic growth in the future. So we've got somebody over here.
I just want to say thank you for coming today. And in undergrad, I was actually a finance major, and especially in business school, I saw a lot of our program didn't really emphasize ethics. It was kind of just assumed in our program. Kids would come in, have a standard morality to enter into the finance world. And having friends that are very interested in that program and seeing how they face, especially if women face these issues of inequality and like pay and how they're treated in the workplace. Do you believe a standard of more sustainable business, sustainable finance kind of lead to solving these problems and create more of a holistic approach to maximizing shareholder wealth along with increasing employee benefits and like decreasing the gap?
Yes. And, one of the things I want to emphasize is when I give this talk to either economics audiences that include people who've been in business, or I gave the talk in Ireland and had people who were CEOs who were interested in corporate reform. They all agreed with this picture completely. Now, anytime I mention the word government, instinctive response, government can't do anything, reform is impossible. But on the idea that there was something wrong with business, that it was promoting the wrong values, that short-termism, steeply banked hierarchies, competitive decision-making produced toxic corporate cultures, got widespread agreement. I mean, I was surprised. And indeed, there's a professor at St. Thomas in Minneapolis who had been with Philips in the Netherlands. And he describes giving his version. Now, his talk is not about gender at all, but it is about the need for cooperation and collaboration in corporate decision-making. And he says when he gives this talk, the senior corporate law people hate it, but anybody who's been in business likes it. So one of the things you do have is you have a realization by the folks in the trenches who, like the people who write the management psych literature, think this is a bad thing, that you need cooperation, that you need loyalty to the company, that you need a longer term perspective. And the head of BlackRock in December, not this year, but a year ago, wrote a letter to their shareholders. This is the largest private equity firm in the world. And it wrote a letter to the shareholders saying this is a problem, the short-termism and the reductionist focus and the failure to invest in the future, which is a product of this. You know, you cut research and development, you cut employee training programs, you cut anything that doesn't produce immediate returns, but the future is shortchanged. So you see a recognition that the system is a problem more generally. And I think my conclusion is no one company can solve it in itself, so long as you've got the threat of activist investor hedge funds coming in and taking over the company if they're not paying enough attention to the bottom line. It has to be something that reduces the competitive dynamic that says, if you do this, your board is happy and you take home $100 billion in bonuses. If you don't do it, you will be out.
So you mentioned, this is fascinating. Thank you so much for being here. And just quickly, hope you can tell us, you had that really interesting teaser about the implications for racial equality being different than gender equality. So I'd love to hear a quick version of that.
So why is racial equality not in here? Because there are no studies that talk about racial differences in narcissism. Does this affect race? And the answer is yes. So if what you get is smaller groups plotting against other groups within a company, and they pick like-minded people they feel they can trust, at least temporarily, and there is more politicized decision-making, do African Americans succeed? No. Some Asian men succeed in places like Silicon Valley, where you have networks of Asian men. But you tend to see outgroups as being disadvantaged. And I would emphasize, when you look at these studies and the individual accounts, you often see women who say, oh, the men told dirty jokes, or they hit on me early in the career, but I just ignored it all. Never a problem until I got to the top ranks. And then I was surprised at the knives being out for me. If you are in a Game of Thrones environment, you need as an ally somebody who enhances your clout in the company. And that tends to magnify discrimination generally. So when we take a look at race and gender and the intersection of race and gender, you tend to see that the gender gap between African-American women and African-American men at the top is much smaller than the gap between white men and white women. But African-American women earn less vis-a-vis white men than any other group.
I think we're out of time. We have a reception upstairs in the faculty lounge. I hope you all will join us and continue the conversation there. Please join me in welcoming.